Live, it's the Inside Scoop, Virginia. All the news Virginians want to know. Here's your host, political insider, George Burke.
Good evening and welcome to tonight's edition of Inside Scoop, Virginia. I got a little bit of a treat for you tonight. We're going to be discussing elections, redistricting, a lot of issues surrounding the last presidential campaign, some demographics in terms of voters both here in the Commonwealth and across the nation. My guests, starting from my left, are Michael McDonald, who's an associate professor of government and politics at George Mason University and a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings institution. He spends a lot of time studying American elections, voter turnout, election administration, and redistricting issues. To his left is Sara Fitsgerald, a former journalist, like myself, who's representing the Falls Church City League of Women Voters. She's also been a member of the state of Virginia's, or Commonwealth of Virginia's, I should say, redistricting study committee. Well, welcome. Glad to have you tonight.
Thank you, George.
Great to be here.
I look forward to a lively conversation on some issues that maybe we'll get into some stuff that maybe the public is not really aware of, because some of this I don't think is talked about as much as it should be. Let's go right into the last presidential. Voter turnout. You know, if you read some of the blogs, you think it all happened because young people came out in droves and voted. If you listen to some of our black leaders across America, it's all because the black vote came out in droves and pulled him over the top. What do you think happened?
Well, all we have to go by right now are the exit polls. And sometime in the coming months, we're going to get a definitive survey from the Census Bureau that's going to answer a lot of these questions. So all we can do is just divine what we see from the exit polls. And what do we see there?
It's more than speculation. I mean, it's based on fact, because you're very involved in exit polling, I understand.
That's right. I'm in the quarantine room on election night, so I actually called the election result in Virginia. So it's the ultimate candy for somebody who studies politics like myself. But I would just caution that we're going to get some more definitive data in the coming months. But what do we know right now? It looks as though, in terms of the age question, that turnout rates increased among all age categories between 2000, 2004, and again 2004 and 2008. There might have been just a slight increase, greater increase among the youngest categories, but again, I just caution to wait to see what happens when we get the census data. For the African American turnout, I think we have something more definitive there at this point, and that's that we did see increases in African American turnout. According to the exit polls in 2004, 11% of the electorate was African American. In 2008, 13% of the electorate was African American. What's interesting, though, is that increased share of the electorate did not come from battleground states like Virginia, North Carolina, where there are significant African-American populations.
I think it's already interesting that we call them battleground states these days. It's really the first time in over 4 decades.
And it actually makes a big difference, too, because turnout rates in Virginia were up significantly, about 7 percentage points from 2004. That battleground status means a lot. But just to complete this thought, the African-American turnout did not come from these battleground states. White turnout kept pace with African-American increases in African-American turnout in Virginia and elsewhere. Where we saw the increased turnout relative to whites were in the non-battleground states, your Mississippi's, your Alabama, the District of Columbia, New York, Illinois, California. So it's interesting. It's not where it really mattered for the election outcome is where we saw the enthusiasm drive people to the polls, where usually if you look in the battleground states, the campaigns are in there battling it out and they're encouraging everybody to vote. There was something about the fact that Barack Obama was on that ballot that really energized and enthused these African Americans to vote in a situation where in another election they wouldn't have voted.
One issue that dealing with the African American vote, and Sara, you and I talked about it a little bit off camera before the show started. I have some friends who are older black males, and for them this was a movement. This was the culmination of decades of hard work, decade. Most of them never thought that they would see a black man as president in their lifetimes. As a result, they were desperate to go to the inauguration and desperate to participate, and most of them, at least those that I could assist in any way, shape, or form in that process, I did. But you had said that to me earlier that you saw the same thing among some blacks, that they felt this was a movement, that this was really a crown. One friend of mine told me it was one of the most important things in his lifetime, other than maybe his personal.
I know that anecdotally, friends who did canvassing and so forth, sometimes over the phone or when you were going door to door, that they would encounter voters for whom this was going to be the first time they voted at age 80, African Americans, or recent immigrants who are now U.S. citizens in Northern Virginia, and the diversity of our population up here. That there was something about the campaign that really motivated them this year to get out and vote, and that was tremendously exciting to those of us like League of Women Voters who do want to promote voter participation and so forth.
It's ironic, the guy who inspects my cars from North Africa, U.S. citizen, and a bunch of his friends who are relatively newly naturalized citizens. I went in one day to have my car inspected. A bunch of them were hanging around. They knew I was involved in politics, and they all had a million questions. And many of them were a bit fearful about going to the polls. They wanted to vote. I told them they could vote early. They weren't interested in voting early. They wanted to participate in the process on that day. But they had lots of questions about the folks who'd be outside the polls and what they would encounter, presumably because of what they had encountered in their home countries in the past. They all had their voting cards. They made an effort, and quite frankly, they were all Obama supporters. But they were very fervent, and for them, that was an important thing. I noticed in both the 8th and the 11th and several other districts across Virginia, the turnout or the voting totals for president, for Obama, exceeded vote totals, for example, for the congressional races in those districts. So that tells me those were a lot of first-time voters who, or as we sometimes call them, presidential voters, who only come out every 4 years. And was there a larger number of those this year than we would see in other years, do you think, of these?
Yeah, that's a good question. We're going to have to wait to get to analyze the election data more thoroughly to know the answer to that question, what academics call roll-off, where you vote for that first office that's on the ballot, but you won't vote for the lower ballots on the races on the ballot. And so, and that does happen during presidential elections, that people, for whatever reason, they look at the president as being the most important election to them, and they don't bother to become informed about those state and local races that are also on the ballot. And in some ways it's a shame, because those state and local races are much closer to their daily lives, and in some cases that's actually the sorts of decisions that are going to directly affect them are being made by those elected officials.
Well, you have to hope too, as people see that their vote for president perhaps made a difference, that will encourage them to become more interested in politics and elections in general, and as they get used to voting and being more involved, will start to pay more attention to those down-ticket races, because I would agree that there was clearly a fall of people who knew about the top race, but if you asked them about the lower candidates, weren't as familiar with them.
Yeah, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that once you vote once, you're much more likely to vote again. So the high turnout that we had in this last election does bode well for continued high levels of engagement in future elections. And it may be that the campaigns they seek out voters. They don't try and register people. Obama's campaign was very unusual in this respect, in which they actually tried to expand the electorate. Most state, local campaigns don't have the resources to conduct extensive voter registration drives. And so now that these people are in the system, they have a record of voting, I expect that the campaigns will be trying to mine votes from these people. And so we may see some increased levels of engagement in state and local elections in the future.
Let me ask you, Michael, do you think it was an effective strategy on Obama's part to register new voters and bring them out? I mean, did that truly make a difference? And again, you may not be able to answer that yet because you don't have all the data.
Yeah, it's interesting. If we look at the data right now, it doesn't seem like it made a difference. The same number of people said that they had a contact with the Obama campaign as they said that they had a contact with the Kerry campaign in 2004. So despite all of this increased mobilization, at least the percentage of people, now turnout was up about 1.6 percentage points from 2004, so maybe that 1.6 percentage points represents a significant number of people that the Obama campaign went out and contacted. The interesting thing here too is when you look at these sorts of mobilization numbers from the exit polls, John McCain's numbers are actually lower than George Bush's numbers in terms of contact from the campaign from 2004, down about 4 percentage points. So there was something going on in this election where people were very enthused for Obama, but on the McCain side, on the Republican side of the ticket, people were not as enthused for McCain. And we can also see this in terms of turnout in some of the red states. Utah, Alaska actually had lower turnout in 2008 than they did in 2004. And Alaska is really an odd case. I don't understand it, because if Sarah Palin was supposed to be this energizing figure for the Republican base, I don't know why turnout would have been down in Alaska.
Do you think that, we saw in some of the polling and some of the lower down ticket races, the congressional races in particular, we saw certainly Republican males moving toward the Republican candidate as the election, at the congressional level, as the election reached the final weeks. They had been undecided earlier on. Anecdotally, at the same time, you'd walk into any Obama headquarters, and of course they multiplied like rabbits, quite frankly, and they were filled with enthusiastic people, predominantly young, but not all young. And the McCain headquarters would be more sedate type of locales, let's to be polite. There didn't seem to be a lot of activity within the offices. Did that make a difference? I mean, was that type of energy, it doesn't appear that it translated that much into a difference in the vote as it probably would have rolled out anyway.
There was this enthusiasm gap, and it manifested itself in lower levels of contact, lower levels of engagement among Republicans, and I also think it hobbled McCain some in fundraising, because although he couldn't accept the fundraising in the general election, the RNC could accept fundraising. That's how presidential candidates in the past have managed to run their voter mobilization drives. So I do think that there was this enthusiasm gap that manifested itself this way in this last election.
I think you had a lot more people, from what I observed, who perhaps were attracted to a political campaign for the first time working in some of these Obama field offices. And I think one of the challenges for the Democrats going forward as to whether they will be able to energize those same people for other Democratic campaigns. I have to say, I've heard from one person I knew who worked in the one of the field offices who said, ever since the November election was over, I've been bombarded with new calls for come work for this campaign or that. And she said, but I was really attracted to Obama. I'm not necessarily attracted to these other Democrats. But I think one thing that made those place fun to work for folks was the diversity of people who worked there. There was just a different kind of political experience. It
was unbelievable when I saw it. We're going to be right back in about 2 minutes. My guests are Michael McDonald and Sara Fitsgerald. And we're talking about last year's elections. So please stay with us, and we'll see you in 2. Thanks for watching.
There's more than just books at the library.
There's more than just books at the library.
Excuse me. There's more than just books at the library.
Il y a plus que de livres à la bibliothèque.
Hello. You have a lot of great books here today. There's more than just books at the library.
I know.
There's more than just books at the library.
I don't want to be hooked to a machine.
I want all the medical treatment available to me.
I wouldn't want my family to have to make this decision.
My doctor knows what's best for me.
An advance directive is your life on your terms. Talk with your family. Decide what's right for you. Then put it in writing.
Documenting my wishes today means my family won't have to make heart-wrenching decisions later.
To learn more, visit www.putitinwriting.org.
1,200 American youth run away from their homes every day. The National Runaway Switchboard is here to help. 1-800-RUNAWAY. If you are a runaway, thinking about running away from home, or a parent or guardian concerned about issues facing your child, call us 24 hours a day. 1-800-RUNAWAY. In times of crisis, hope is just a phone call away. 1-800-RUNAWAY.
I'm Supervisor Sharon Bulova, and I am the Democratic candidate for the chairman of the Fairfax County Board of Supervisors. The special election is scheduled for February 3rd, and I hope to have your vote. Our quality of life in Fairfax County is second to none, and I'm committed to keeping it that way. Our schools are among the best in the nation. We're the safest community of our size in the United States, and Newsweek magazine describes us as one of the greatest success stories of our times. We're facing some difficult challenges as we tackle the economic crisis affecting Fairfax and other local governments across the nation. But I promise you, we will address them with fiscal responsibility and with sensitivity. I look forward to working with you and for you, and respectfully ask for your vote on February 3rd. Thanks so much.
Once again, George Burke with the Inside Scoop, Virginia.
Welcome back. We are talking about politics from a nonpartisan standpoint, looking at some of the electoral votes. We're going to touch upon redistricting and some issues along those lines. My guests are GMU professor Michael McDonald, who has a lot of expertise in a lot of these areas. Former journalist Sara Fitsgerald, who's now with the Falls Church City League of Women Voters and has served on the League of Women Voters State Redistricting Study Committee as well. So welcome back. For full disclosure, you know, they're being nonpartisan. I'm a Democrat, as I think most of my viewers know. I'm the 11th District Chair, sit on the State Party Steering Committee, and I serve now on the staff of newly elected Congressman Jerry Connolly. But we're not into the spitting and vinegar partisan politics today. We're more into the process, I think, and it's intriguing me. I want to commend Falls Church City. Once again, they came in first in terms of voter turnout across Northern Virginia.
We even had a little wager with Charlottesville this year, which we continue to win.
I saw that, and historically, but turnout was up, it seemed to me, across Northern Virginia. Not as much as people hoped. I mean, everybody hoped to reach 80%, or certainly New Arlington, that was their big push. Now, you did hit 80% in Falls Church City, but I think it was the only jurisdiction in Northern Virginia that did. They hovered around 78, 77% along those lines, which was still a pretty good turnout. I just want to delve a little bit more into the turnout and into the motivation of these Obama voters versus the McCain voters. Again, anecdotally, I had friends who voted both times for Bush, but after the second time for Bush were disenchanted with where he was moving the country and said for the first time they were going to cast their lot for a Democrat and vote for Obama. And I think Obama did have some appeal across party lines, but that's anecdotally. What do you think?
I think that's true if you look at the state. And I told many people, reporters among others, and was quoted in the press on this prior to the election, that the key battleground state in Virginia would be the D.C. exurbs, Loudoun, Prince William, Stafford counties. If Obama was able to match Tim Kaine's margin of victory out in those areas, then Obama would win. I mean, naturally, because Kaine also won those areas. But the thing about those areas, which I think makes them important swing areas within the state, is that the people who live out there are more economic conservatives than they are social conservatives. And so, tongue-in-cheek, what I would say is that there are no moose and hockey rinks out in those areas. Now, I know there's some hockey rinks, but there are no moose out there. And so those voters were not motivated on issues of social issues as much as they were on the declining value of their home. Many of them, in order to buy that dream house out in the DC exurbs, traded in a long commute into the DC area, and so they were very much concerned about gas prices as well. And so this double whammy that was affecting these people out in that area, I think that was one of the key motivations behind Obama's victory in Virginia.
There were some other places too. I mean, Obama did very well in the Hampton Roads area, much better than I would have anticipated. Now there is a large black population down there, but I don't know whether that was the difference or not in that area. I know it was worked very, very hard by Obama, but didn't he also win like Henrico County and some of the Richmond suburbs as well? And was that a surprise to you?
Well, again, I think it's that same sort of effect down around the Richmond area. Now, if you get closer to Virginia Beach, it looks as though perhaps Obama had a little bit greater support among military personnel than Kerry did in 2004. So it was probably a combination of factors that were affecting the outcome down in the Virginia Beach area.
I think that's ironic when Kerry was a decorated veteran, and I don't believe Obama served in the military. Now, there was, of course, we had the swift boating in '04 that I think certainly had the so-called, as they called it, those attacks certainly had an impact on his public persona and how people perceived him as the election drew near. I mean, it's the power of the media, it's the power of the message.
Well, I don't think that's it, though. Not
no,
just that,
yeah.
though. It's also that you have to remember the timing of what happened for Kerry in 2004 and even in 2002. Republicans were riding a very high wave of patriotism, and that patriotism inevitably is directed towards the president. And so for better or worse, 9/11 and then the Iraq invasion were rallying points for the American people, and it was keeping Bush's approval ratings at higher levels. And really, Virginia was the canary in the coal mine on this in 2005, when we started seeing that luster wear off of the Republican brand name, and the Democrats did very well in 2005. And so I would say, look at 2005. I think we're going to presage what happened in 2006. What's curious, though, is that 2006 election, where the Democrats took control of the House of Representatives and the Senate, despite long odds, and we're going to talk about redistricting, the odds were stacked in the Republicans' favor because Democrats had to win in some districts that were very difficult for them to win in. And they did that despite the deck being stacked against them in redistricting. Usually we see in American politics that when the pendulum swings to one party that decisively, it usually swings back. It usually moderates back. And it's unusual now for us to see, I really say 2005, 2006, 2007, 2008, to see for an extended period of time for that pendulum to be pegged in one direction. So it does make me wonder if we may be seeing a more fundamental change to politics in America, like we might have seen, say, during the Great Depression, like we would have seen in 1860 during the Civil War, what we in academia call realigning elections, where we see this real shift in the loyalties of voters. We've never seen that in modern elections, so we don't know what it looks like. And it could be that that's what's going on right now. I would say certainly, you look at these young voters, the level of support that Obama had among young voters, people establish their partisanship in the first time they vote, and then they vary that over the course of their lives. So now the Democrats are starting off with a lot of buildup in support among these young people. It's not going to go away in 2012 because the same Obama is going to appeal to these young voters again in 2012. And so this may be something prolonged. It may be something that's a fundamental change in American politics.
I wonder whether we'll see him participate in 2010 in the midterm elections.
As president, you would expect that he would, because depending on how things go, it's going to be important for him to keep his Democratic majority, and presumably will want to build on it, even though that's always a challenge for an incumbent president.
Yeah, I think in a midterm you'll probably see Certainly the Republicans trying to build on it. I suspect you'll see the Democrats nationally trying to protect what they've achieved to a great degree, knowing that they won't have the same opportunities that they tend to have when they have a strong presidential candidate.
Well, one of the interesting things will be to see how he marshals these new groups that he's developed, the millions of email addresses, and to try to create an advocacy group to continue to work for his platform, and he's got several different sort of sub-organizations off of his campaign. And of course, you have a challenge when you raise people's expectations of how they can continue to be involved and impact the evolution of his administration. But I think it's going to be very interesting times.
Yeah, but history is not on the Democrat side on this. You look at 1980, and then you look at the 1982 congressional elections. Democrats lost big in 1982. You look at 1992, then look at 1994. Democrats lose big in 1994. We generally see when there is this sort of shift towards the party that wins the presidency, there's in a big sort of way, like a 1980 election, there's usually what we call midterm loss, where the party in power loses seats, because the other party, and the Republicans were not as enthused, again, in this last election. They are going to become enthused, because everything that Obama does, they're going to hate, and eventually that's going to energize them, and the Democrats, though, are going to love things, so they're going to be complacent. And so again, history is not on the Democrat side, but maybe there's a big change that's going on that they may overcome history.
I saw this week Mitch Stewart, who had run the campaign here in Virginia for Obama, and I believe he spent some time in North Carolina before that, is now in charge of one of these groups that are going to be a subset of Obama voters to keep them together and to keep them active and keep them moving. I think it'll be interesting to see whether they succeed in that. Whether that will impact the congressional elections as much as the next presidential, I just don't know.
Well, just look at that special election that happened here in Northern Virginia, where the Democrat Herring only wins by 16 votes, right? And that's in a district that Obama, I think, won 68, 70% of the vote in the presidential election. So just a couple months later, now they're neck and neck in a race. So again, we're going to have to see if Obama and the Democrats can translate that victory in 2008, all the organization that they built up, all those volunteers, translate that into a larger political movement.
And when we get back, I want to get into redistricting. I don't think a lot of our viewers understand the significance of redistricting and how it impacts congressional races, state senate races, and races for the House of Delegates, not only in our state, in our Commonwealth, but in every state of the Union. More than others, some more than others. Stay with us, we'll be back in 2 minutes.
Around the world, 1 out of every 3 women will be beaten or otherwise abused in their lifetime, often by a family member or loved one. A future free from violence. It's all she's ever wished for.
Did you know you have the power to stop children from joining gangs? You can help a father find a job and home for his family. You can assist a woman who can't afford the medicine she needs to live and the home she can't live without. You can choose to make a difference in our community. Support Volunteers of America, and you can help improve the lives of nearly 2 million Americans each year with programs and services that help individuals and families overcome their challenges to become as independent as possible. Support the programs that are working in our community. Contact Volunteers of America today. Call 1-800-899-0089.
For some folks, saving for the future is easy, but for you, it might take a little more effort. Saving for your future is your responsibility, and there's a lot to save for.
I never thought of that.
Like your child's education, perhaps uncovered medical expenses, or just to be sure you can live the way you want when you retire. The time is now to save for tomorrow? Save now or work forever? The choice is yours. Choose to save.
Once again, George Burke with the Inside Scoop, Virginia.
Welcome back. We're discussing demographics, now redistricting with Sara Fitsgerald with the League of Women Voters in Falls Church City, and GMU professor Michael McDonald. They both have areas of expertise that now dovetail in this redistricting whole issue. I want to remind our viewers, February 3rd, we have a special election here in Fairfax County for chairman of the Fairfax County Board of Supervisors. We will be replacing now Congressman Jerry Connolly with the new chairman. I encourage everybody to vote. It is an extraordinarily important election in the region's largest jurisdiction. So get out there and vote on February 3rd. All your normal polling places, normal polling times, 6 a.m. to 7 p.m. I believe it is. It'll be a low turnout election. Your vote will make a difference, so please get out there and vote that day. Sara, let's talk about redistricting a little bit. Just before we broke, I mentioned that most people don't understand what it is nor the significance of redistricting and what it means in terms of who we elect to office.
Well, George, the League believes redistricting reform is so important that it's their single legislative priority this year, and it's something that only happens once every 10 years and can really impact congressional and legislative politics for the next decade. And so we're coming up on it again in 2011 following the 2010 census. And what the basic issue is that under the Virginia Constitution, the General Assembly has the authority to redraw the districts for both Congress and the legislature. And so you create a situation where the politicians are choosing their voters as opposed to voters choosing their politicians. And what happens when redistricting is done in a partisan way is you can create districts that are guaranteed that one party is going to win them. It can really impact the complexion of a legislature and congressional districts. And unfortunately, over time, also can encourage situations in which legislators and congressmen have very little competition. In our last, in November, 8 out of the 11 congressional seats in Virginia were not competitive races. They were decided by margins of greater than 10%, and in some cases, 2 incumbent congressmen had no opposition. And so even in a case where a politician is very qualified and very dedicated, this can't be healthy for a democracy when people have no competition. And also the other thing that it happens is it tends to make people politicians playing to their base more, and it narrows the ability to reach compromise, makes, I think, our politics more polarized, and a lot of things that we think are really a negative result.
You had an example that you had told us off camera dealing with, I guess, Bobby Rush and Barack Obama when it was a state senate seat at that point, I believe. Yeah, well, we had a comment there from Marion, Florida, and the thing that happens here with these districts, some of them are so uncompetitive that a candidate will have no opposition when they run for re-election. And Florida is one of the few states in the country is if there's only one candidate on the ballot, they don't even hold the election. So you can imagine then the roll-off that was happening in that in some of these Florida congressional races. Nobody was voting because there was no election to vote for. And so how do these politicians do it? Barack Obama went through this experience when he was still a state senator in Illinois. So in 2000, he had ambitions to run for higher office, and he was going to challenge Bobby Rush, who was his congressman in the Chicago area. He challenged him in a primary, and he got 38% of the vote. He did pretty good, but he didn't unseat Bobby Rush. And given an opportunity for Bobby Rush to redraw his district in 2001, what did he do? He took Barack Obama's house and moved it out of his district. Cut the line such that it no longer went along his district line. And so at that point, Barack Obama had to start making some choices and decisions about what
he was going to do in his future career, and what he had learned from that experience of being in that 2000 primary election was that he was very capable of building biracial, multiracial coalitions. And so he then had an opportunity to do some gerrymandering of his own. And so what did he do? He took his state Senate district and added more whites along the lake there, Lake Michigan, and more affluent whites, and built a biracial coalition for his own election. And that was his stepping stone. He started developing the themes that would be very crucial for him to win the Senate and then the presidency. Now the thing is, Barack Obama is an unusual politician in that he's capable of doing all of this, and he's managed to survive his redistricting. More often what the case is that incumbents are indeed drawing their opposition out of their district. If you're a Republican, you're moving those Democrats out of your district, so you won't have a real challenge then from a Democratic candidate in a general election. And what's interesting too is that you may have an adjoining Democrat representing a district that's adjoining to that Republican, and that Democrat will be more than happy to take those Democrats and exchange some Republicans back. And in the end, what you get is a situation where 90% plus of incumbents win re-election, and there's very little competition. Less than 10% of our congressional races are competitive by a very generous measure, which is a margin of less than 10 percentage points.
Now, Sara, we have redistricting coming up in a couple of years here in Virginia. And I know that you're paying some attention to that here in the Commonwealth. It looks like the nonpartisan redistricting bill took its first blow in the General Assembly just recently. It was defeated in the House, I believe.
Well, what happened, and it was very disappointing to people, post-editorialized about the situation, just from a kind of good government transparency standpoint. The House Privileges and Elections Subcommittee set a meeting at 7 a.m. on the Martin Luther King holiday, when certainly many of us up here in Northern Virginia were focused on the inauguration going on and things, and voted on party line vote to kill two of the main vehicles for folks who want to try to create a bipartisan redistricting commission to help draw up the plan that would then be turned over to the General Assembly for approval. And one thing it's important to mention is it's not just traditional good government organizations like the League of Women Voters who are supporting this. This approach is now supported by a broad-based coalition that includes the Virginia Chamber of Commerce, AARP, League of Conservation Voters, Virginia Interfaith Center on Public Policy, because they really think that this is at the heart of producing good government and people getting appropriate venues for legislation of whatever form. The Chamber has been very concerned because of the budget stalemates we get into Virginia, as well as gridlock over transportation issues, which is very important to our future economic development. And so having watched what's happened over time, they really believe that this is a better way to go. And actually across the country, many more states are adopting this approach, and there are some moves afoot in Congress as well to try to mandate it at the congressional level as well.
Let's talk a little bit more about the actual mechanics. First of all, the art of redistricting is far more sophisticated today than it was in the past because of technology. You can look at voting patterns, you can look at demographics, you can look at ethnic groups, you can look at many different factors that would impact how a district would vote for one candidate or another. So as a result, you've got those tools. Secondly, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but generally the party in power is the party that has the most control over redistricting. Although certainly the members of the party out of power may still benefit as they try to, let's look at Virginia. Let's say the Republicans rule the roost, which I think they did back around the 2000 census. They rule the roost. They still will maybe help some Democrats so they can solidify Republican districts. Like Bobby Scott's congressional district, for example, was drawn as a black district. Jim Moran's district in the 8th district was drawn as a Democratic district because I know I lived deeper into the 11th, and now I live right up and butt up against the 8th because they took certain Democratic areas out of the 11th and dropped them into the 8th. And I think in the 11th, it's an interesting circumstance where it was redrawn to make it more Republican after the 2000 census, but it's gradually bled back to, we think, a blue district now. I mean, Connolly won and won by about 12 points, but he's certainly a well-known figure in a good part of that district as it stands now. So let's talk a little bit more about the mechanics.
Well, there's so much to cover here, and one of the things that I want to first point out here is that there are some districts, like Scott's district, which are required to be drawn the way which they are for voting rights concerns. We have the 1965 Voting Rights Act, and many amendments to that act, which mandate that if you have the possibility of drawing a district that can elect a minority candidate of choice, you must draw that district. And Virginia is one of the jurisdictions that's covered under a special part of the Voting Rights Act called Section 5, which requires that the state and jurisdictions really within the state submit any redistricting plan to the Justice Department or the District Court of D.C. for approval before it can take effect to ensure that there's no retrogression of minority representation. And so some of the funniest looking districts that often are put up as exemplars of bad behavior by in the redistricting process are really protected voting rights districts. Now, there are a lot of other bad districts out there too, so don't get me wrong. There are other districts that also have problems with it, but for the most part, those districts are the types of districts that are protected. And we have to do this, by the way, every 10 years because population shifts. And if we didn't do this, what would happen over time, and this is in the early part of this last century, for half a century, some of the states didn't redistrict at all, and rural areas gained much more representation versus the fast-growing urban areas. So we have to do this. Now, how can we do it, and how can we do it better? And that's some of the issues that the League talks about. Looking at the situation that we have in Virginia, where we have Democrats in control of the state Senate, and that's not going to change until the next redistricting, unless there's some unfortunate
The thinnest of control.
Yes.
I think they have a 21.
Yeah, so there's no, there's unlikely going to be a change of control there. And, unfortunately, I hate to tell you, I think most likely it'll be that the Republicans control the House of Delegates after this next election as well. So looking forward, we're probably going to have a divided legislature. And it's going to be very difficult then for these two chambers to agree on maps for the state. So what's most likely to happen are one or two scenarios. One scenario is that this just gets thrown to the courts because we have to do the redistricting to equalize population. If the political process can't produce a map, then the courts will act and produce a map. That's most likely what's going to happen. There is another option, and it may happen here in Virginia, which is that the two sides can cut a bipartisan deal in a very interesting way. The House of Delegates can redistrict their districts, the Senate can redo their districts, and then the two chambers will just log roll over. So we'll get a Republican gerrymander out of the House of Delegates and a Democratic gerrymander out of the Senate. Nevada, New Mexico were two states that did that in this last decade of redistricting. We may see that in Virginia. I think most likely we will probably end up in the courts.
One of the things that makes it particularly challenging in Virginia, too, is that because of our legislative elections occurring in 2011, you have to redistrict fairly quickly, so there's a limited time to get the process done.
When we get back, I want you to tell me how we make the process fair from your estimation. How you make it fair. And is it truly fair, depending on who? We're all subjective beings, so if you we'll be back in 2 minutes. Stay with us, please.
She's had more than a dozen fractures. And in the next few years, she faces 2 major surgeries to strengthen her fragile bones. She's only 10 years old. Most people don't worry about fragile bones until late in life. For those with osteogenesis imperfecta, brittle bones are a concern throughout their lifetime. Find out how you can strengthen this child's future.
Diabetes is a killer. After I was diagnosed, I didn't feel sick, so I didn't listen to my doctor. Then it struck. I had a heart attack, then a stroke. and I was only 49.
Most people with diabetes also have high blood pressure and cholesterol, which can cause severe heart damage. In fact, 2 out of 3 people with diabetes die from heart disease or stroke.
Don't let diabetes destroy your life.
Call for your free diabetes survival guide. Choose to live.
I'm Supervisor Sharon Bulova, and I am the Democratic candidate for the chairman of the Fairfax County Board of Supervisors. The special election is scheduled for February 3rd, and I hope to have your vote. Our quality of life in Fairfax County is second to none, and I'm committed to keeping it that way. Our schools are among the best in the nation. We're the safest community of our size in the United States, and Newsweek magazine describes us as one of the greatest success stories of our times. We're facing some difficult challenges as we tackle the economic crisis affecting Fairfax and other local governments across the nation. But I promise you, we will address them with fiscal responsibility and with sensitivity. I look forward to working with you and for you, and respectfully ask for your vote on February 3rd. Thanks so much.
Once again, George Burke with the Inside Scoop, Virginia.
Welcome back as we move into our last segment. I think we could have used another hour, to tell you the truth. My guests tonight are Sara Fitsgerald, who is with the League of Women Voters, and Michael McDonald, a professor from George Mason University, who is an expert in redistricting and a student of American politics, is how I think I'll describe it.
We all are. If you live here and you're a good citizen, you should be.
Sara, how do we make redistricting fair? How do we make, first of all, how do we make the process fair so it's truly unbiased or objective? And second of all, how do we define what is fair and what is not fair?
Well, the latter is always, I suppose, going to be in the eye of the beholder. But to go to your previous question, I mean, some of the ideas for bipartisan commissions that take it out of the hands of the politicians, and around the states there's lots of different proposals for that. Here in Virginia, I think the bill that has gained the most currency called for a 7-member commission, and both parties appointing people to it, and then the members of the commission would choose their chairman, and that presumably would be somebody who would be acceptable to both sides. I think the bill, or one of the leading proposals, called to draw those people from a pool of retired judges, and so you're looking for people who you like to think have a record of impartiality and so forth. And again, across the nation, there are a lot of different proposals. In California, which just approved a redistricting commission through a referendum, citizens referendum, they've got a very complicated procedure that I think is designed to respond to the notion of politicians stacking redistricting commissions with their people to try to keep it into the hands of concerned citizens as much as possible. But again, it involves people of good faith trying to do their best. And when people sit down and try to do redistricting, there's lots of criteria that people seek to incorporate, and sometimes, as Mike would agree, you can't always do all those things at the same time. There's a notion that districts should be compact, they should try to be contiguous. You want to try to preserve jurisdictional boundaries, be cognizant of geographical boundaries, of which we have some challenges here in Virginia with bodies of water and so forth. And then, you know, some people would like to promote competitiveness as well. Now, sometimes it's hard to do all those things, and as we discussed, still make a district competitive. For instance, if you put Alexandria and Arlington into a district, it's probably going to be a trending Democratic district. One thing that will be interesting in the next round is as Northern Virginia will presumably gain some seats as a result of our population
in the
growth.
House of Delegates.
Right.
Yeah.
There will be losers downstate, and how this plays out in terms of where those districts are drawn. You may have, you know, members who are going to be forced to compete against each other, and some will choose to retire. But again, what's fair for one person may not seem to be fair for the next. So there is a certain amount of subjectivity about it. Ironically, some people have criticized the addition of computer models because with all the demographic data we have now about voting patterns, it does become a lot easier to look at those results and draw districts. But I think it's also possible to do redistricting strictly by computer and eliminate those things and say, here are my criteria, you know, first, second, and third, and, you know, see what a nonpartisan computer comes up with when you're not calculating in those kinds of partisan concerns. So that even works both ways.
Under the proposal in Virginia and under some of these other proposals, ultimately, does the legislature have some role of ratifying this? Or
yeah, here in Virginia,
I presume they'd have to have some
role. Well, without
role
a constitutional amendment here in Virginia, they have the ultimate authority to approve it. Now, some people are actually advocating for a constitutional amendment to take it totally out of the hands of the legislature. One reason that hadn't been popular, A, people don't always like to go into the Constitution if they can avoid it, and B, because of our timetable into 2011, that's no longer really possible. But there are some states that have taken it out of the hands of the legislature, and other states have tried to create a mechanism where it makes it very hard for the legislature to reverse what a Citizens Commission has come up with, and also I think, and you'd agree, Michael, increases the likelihood it would be successfully challenged in the courts.
Let me play the devil's advocate for a minute. The legislature are the members of a legislature are the representatives of the people. Appointed judges, no matter who they're chosen by, are not necessarily representatives of the people in the eyes of the Constitution, and I think even in the eyes of laws. Is that making it more democratic or less democratic by putting all that power into the hands of 6 or 7 or 10 or 15 individuals who all, whether they've been judges or not, certainly in Virginia, judges are appointed, not elected, but in many states they're elected, and they're elected by party. But even here in Virginia, judges have to work the legislature in order to get appointed.
Well, you know, that actually
is that fair?
I think that's a valid complaint, and where you hear this particularly from are the minority communities who have fought so hard to get representation in a legislature, and now, just as they have a seat at the table, that seat in the redistricting process is taken away from them and it's put into a commission. So you find NAACP, the equivalent, NALEO and others on MALDEF on the Hispanic side, being very much against sort of redistricting reform for this very reason. And they say, well, look, I mean, these members know their districts best, they know the communities in their districts the best, they should be the one who's making these decisions. And that would be all and well if they just didn't abuse their power all the time and do the sorts of things where they cut out their opponent or try and bolster up their safety by manipulating the district lines. And so I would say that, yes, if we could trust politicians to act in a fair manner, that would be a good way of doing this. And maybe there are ways we can structure this. Maybe we can have public submissions. Maybe we can have more input, openness in the process.
Let me just interrupt and play devil's advocate again. The term gerrymandering dates back to a governor of Massachusetts named Jerry, and I think it was in the 1700s, if I'm not correct.
1812.
1812.
Gary.
Okay, I was close.
Elbridge Gary is his name, and then we bastardized it to be Jerry. Yeah.
And so, and that's true because Gary Studs, the congressman from Massachusetts, was a descendant of that governor, and it's spelled Jerry, but he was pronounced it Gary. Well, so this has been happening since basically the beginning of our country.
Even before that. In fact, I learned from a publication that Michael contributed to that perhaps one of the first ones was done by Patrick Henry, who tried to keep James Madison, a father of the Constitution, from being elected to the first Congress because Patrick Henry wasn't supportive of the Constitution. And so he tried to draw the districts in Virginia from the very start to exclude Madison from being elected to that Congress. He didn't succeed.
We can't blame today's politicians. They're just practicing what has been practiced since the beginning of our history. I'm surprised they didn't embody it into the Constitution or the Declaration of Independence.
Madison was very concerned about this, actually. He warned in some of his letters that he was concerned that elected officials would manipulate electoral laws to their benefit. And so he really did, the whole reason why the state legislatures have control of this rather than Congress members for congressional redistricting is he didn't want Congress members to be able to do their own redistricting.
And I think what makes it worse are our new technology tools, because you can get much more sophisticated in terms of knowing exactly where your voters are, you know, down to the precinct level and so forth. And that makes it, I think, easier to abuse the system.
A good elected official better know their district. And if they don't, then they're going to find themselves in a very competitive election if they don't know how to win an election in their district. And so that's where, if we actually look in the history of redistricting, we can find people who, like Phil Burton out in California, who's the architect of some wonderful gerrymanders, if you like those sorts of things, back in the 1970s and 80s. He did it all in his head. He didn't have a computer. He knew where every trailer park was in the state of California. So there are Pauls who have this knowledge within their state, and they're able to draw these maps without the benefit of having a computer.
Martin Frost of Texas was another one, I think, who had, because a friend of mine worked for him, who for a long time was a mastermind of the redistricting in Texas. Of course, at the end, the Republicans for a while dominated that in more recent years.
Well, and what can happen, unfortunately, and it sometimes may take a decade for it to happen, but as political gerrymandering occurs and people get more and more solidified in their roles in controlling their district, they tend to, you know, as we talked about yesterday in our discussion, have this arrogance of power where they forget about their voters, and then they tend to, you know, forget why they were elected and being responsive to, you know, a wide range of concerns, and they make it to the other extreme where they are in fact voted out. Now, it takes a while for the pendulum to swing, but sometimes, you know, that will happen as well.
We are unfortunately running out of time. We only have about 30 seconds left. Is there any final 10 words that either of you would like to utter before we go off the air relative to this whole process? I found the discussion fascinating, and I want to thank both of you for being here today. And I don't even think I'm going to have time to give you 10 words.
Well, I just say I hope the viewers become educated, because it's a very important issue.
Sara Fitsgerald, Michael McDonald, thank you very much. It was a great show. I understand you had a nice program that you did the other day, a forum on this very subject. Thanks for watching, and we will see you next week.